A sailor steps ashore in the summer of 1348, unnoticed among the noise of trade and salt-stained labor. By nightfall, fever grips him. By dawn, black swellings rise beneath his skin. Within days, entire households vanish. What if the end of a world did not come with fire or war, but in silence, carried in breath, in touch, in the very air? In England, death did not announce itself. It multiplied. And before anyone understood what was happening, society itself began to collapse from within one body at a time. Before the plague, England appeared stable, even prosperous. Its population had expanded dramatically, nearing 4 million, and cities pulsed with commerce. Towering cathedrals dominated skylines, symbols of faith and hierarchy. Society functioned through a rigid structure. Lords controlled land, peasants labored, and the harvest sustained all. It was a system that seemed permanent, divinely ordained, and unchangeable. Yet beneath this apparent stability, strain had already set in. Climate shifts had shortened growing seasons, weakening agricultural output. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 left deep scars, with widespread malnutrition lingering long after the crisis passed. Overcrowded towns became breeding grounds for disease, their narrow streets clogged with waste, their air thick with decay. In rural villages, families lived tightly packed with livestock sharing space and contamination alike. Life still followed predictable rhythms, religious calendars, seasonal labor, communal obligations, but resilience had quietly eroded. A surplus of labor kept wages low and mobility nearly impossible. A peasant's fate was sealed at birth, bound to land and lord alike. This was not a world prepared for shock. It was a system already weakened, stretched to its limits. And when the unseen threat finally arrived, it would not simply disrupt this order, it would shatter it completely, exposing how fragile it had always been. The force that would devastate England did not originate within its borders. It emerged far to the east, embedded in the ecology of rodent populations across Central Asia. There, a bacterium existed in uneasy balance with its hosts. But environmental disruptions, drought followed by flooding, triggered a deadly shift. Infected animals moved closer to human settlements, and the disease crossed species. What followed was not random spread, but acceleration through connection. Trade routes that once symbolized prosperity became conduits of catastrophe. Caravans crossing vast distances carried not only silk and spices, but infection. The vast network of exchange linking continents now worked in reverse, delivering death with unprecedented speed. By the mid-14th century, reports of entire cities collapsing began to circulate. Still, Europe remained detached, viewing distant suffering as remote and irrelevant. That illusion shattered when the disease reached key trading hubs. One critical moment came during a siege in the Black Sea region, where infected corpses were weaponized and hurled into a besieged city. Whether by design or inevitability, the disease entered maritime routes. Ships fled carrying terrified survivors and unseen contagion. Ports across the Mediterranean became ignition points. Crews arrived already dying vessels drifting with lifeless bodies aboard. Attempts to repel them failed. The infection had already disembarked. By early 1348, the chain reaction was unstoppable. England, still unaware, stood directly in its path. The disease entered England quietly through a single port, and within weeks transformed entire communities into graveyards. What began as isolated deaths in a coastal town quickly escalated into a relentless wave moving inland. Bristol, one of the kingdom's busiest trade centers, collapsed with terrifying speed. Streets, once filled with merchants and noise, fell silent, as if life itself had been erased. Grass began creeping over roads that had never known stillness. Markets stood abandoned. Workshops ceased their rhythms. The transformation was not sudden chaos, but a slow, suffocating absence. Even as people remained alive, the structure of daily life dissolved around them. London soon followed. Densely packed and unprepared, it became the epicenter of mass death. At the height of the crisis, hundreds perished daily. Burial systems failed almost immediately. Churchyards overflowed, forcing authorities to dig vast emergency pits. At first, bodies were placed carefully with dignity, but as numbers surged, that order vanished. Corpses were layered in trenches stripped of ceremony. The psychological rupture was even more profound than the physical devastation. Fear overtook obligation. Families abandoned one another. Parents fled from children. The instinct to survive replaced centuries of moral and religious duty. Communities fractured into isolated individuals, each avoiding contact, each trapped in private terror. England was not only losing people, it was losing the bonds that made society possible. As death spread unchecked, the frameworks that once explained the world began to collapse. The church central to medieval life could not stop the plague. Priests died in staggering numbers, leaving parishes without guidance or ritual. The dying were often denied last rites, a fate more terrifying than death itself for a deeply religious society. In response, extraordinary measures emerged. Religious authority loosened its grip, allowing ordinary people to perform sacred duties once reserved for clergy. This shift, born of desperation, quietly undermined centuries of institutional control. For the first time, individuals were forced to confront their own salvation without the church as mediator. At the same time, fear demanded explanation. If prayer failed, then someone must be responsible. Across Europe, suspicion turned into violence. Minority communities became targets of accusation, blamed for poisoning wells or spreading disease. Despite official attempts to halt such claims, waves of persecution erupted, revealing how quickly fear could distort reason. Meanwhile, alternative expressions of faith emerged. Groups of penitents traveled from town to town, publicly inflicting pain upon themselves in hopes of divine forgiveness. These movements bypassed traditional religious structures, signaling a deeper crisis of belief. The plague exposed not only the limits of medical knowledge, but the fragility of faith itself. When the old answers failed, people did not find clarity. They found chaos, desperation, and a growing sense that the world no longer followed the rules they had always trusted. When the first wave of death receded, England did not return to normal. It emerged into something unrecognizable. Nearly half the population had vanished. Fields lay abandoned, homes stood empty, and entire villages disappeared from the map. Yet within this devastation, a profound shift began to take shape. For the first time in centuries, labor became scarce. Survivors once bound tightly to land and lord now held leverage. Peasants moved freely, seeking better wages and conditions. Payments rose sharply, sometimes tripling. Even women long restricted in economic roles saw significant increases in their earnings. The rigid structure of feudalism began to fracture under the pressure of new economic realities. Landowners, desperate to maintain production, attempted to resist this shift. Laws were passed to freeze wages and restrict mobility, demanding that workers accept pre-plague conditions. But enforcement proved difficult. The balance of power had already changed, and beneath the surface, resentment grew. At the same time, the landscape itself transformed. With fewer hands available for farming, England shifted from labor-intensive crops to livestock, particularly sheep. Pastures replaced fields and wool production expanded rapidly. Technology too advanced as necessity drove innovation. Mills and mechanical solutions began to replace human labor. What had once been a static hierarchical society was becoming fluid and adaptive. Not by choice, but by force. The plague had not only destroyed it, had reset the terms of survival. The Black Death did not end with a single wave. It returned again and again, reinforcing the changes it had begun. Entire generations grew up in a world where death was expected, where stability was an illusion. Yet paradoxically, those who survived often lived better than those before them. Healthier, better fed, and with greater access to resources. But the psychological cost was immense. Art and culture became saturated with images of mortality. Death was no longer distant or abstract. It was immediate, personal, and unavoidable. This shift reshaped how people understood life, faith, and their place in the world. At the same time, long-standing institutions continued to weaken. The church, unable to explain or control the catastrophe, lost part of its authority. Social mobility increased. Local governance and new forms of organization began to emerge. The old feudal order, once unquestioned, slowly unraveled. These changes were not deliberate reforms. They were the byproducts of collapse. A society built on stability had been forced into reinvention. By the mid-14th century, England was no longer the same nation that had existed before 1348. It was more dynamic, more uncertain, and more open to change. The plague had acted as a brutal catalyst, dismantling the past and laying the foundations for a different future. What emerged was not a better world, but a transformed one, shaped by loss, driven by adaptation, and forever marked by the knowledge that everything could vanish in an instant.